Went to SMU and I met her, and I only stayed until she was murdered. I never went back to college. I thought, okay, now I'm going to become a private investigator.
In America, around 1/3 of homicides go unsolved every year. But when cases go cold, for the victims' friends and families, the hunt for justice continues.
She was so incredibly vivacious. We were very different in some ways, but then we kind of complemented each other.
Sheila met Angela Samota at Southern Methodist University in Dallas in 1982.
Our family dynamics were pretty much the same. I didn't have a father, she didn't have a father, and so that kind of brought us together. Angie was the type, not only would she help someone, she would open the door, and if they needed something, she would do it.
On October the 12th, 1984, 20-year-old Angie went out for drinks with friends.
I wasn't around on campus or at the dorm. I actually was home. Back then, there were no cell phones. So I walked in and the phone was ringing. I picked it up, and it was one of her sorority sisters. And so she obviously told me the news, which I did not take well at all.
The terrible news was that Angie had been raped and murdered in her own home.
I mean, this man stabbed her 18 times, broke bones, everything. When they went in and found Angie, there was so much blood, it looked like her heart had been cut out. The police officers were typical police officers. It was all business. They needed to know things. We went through, her schedule, who her friends were, her boyfriend, what did I think of him, and the different people in her life. At the very beginning, you didn't know who killed her. You didn't know if it was her boyfriend. You didn't know if it was an acquaintance that we all ran around. I became fearful. So going out was off the table. So I dropped out of college, I moved back home, and I was done.
The police investigated, but no one was charged. By the summer of 1985, the case had gone cold. Sheila moved to Nashville, got married and had a family, but never forgot about her friend.
I actually don't think I've ever moved on from that, to be very frank. Plus, when something like that happens in your life, you want to honor the person that has been murdered.
A decade later, Sheila was watching the trial of O.J. Simpson on television when a major advance in forensic science caught her attention.
And I remember sitting in bed watching that, thinking, there's this thing called DNA. I sort of remember it in college, but I don't know what it is. And then they started explaining it. And then when they said they could actually take that DNA and put it to a person, then I thought, well, we've got a little hope here. But I didn't know exactly what to do. And I knew we had semen. I knew we had fingernails, and I knew that we had a blood type. There was an organization out of New York that I contacted, but they said since I was in law enforcement, they could not work with me. It was absolutely time to do something. I called the Dallas police, and I asked them if I could talk to the police officer that ran the case, the detective. 50 phone calls. 50 phone calls. They totally ignored me, absolutely ignored me. And I now know that when you call a police department and you call consistently and constantly, they know you. So they didn't return the phone call. I started calling more and more and more, and I kept getting blown off each time. So at that point, I thought, okay, now I'm going to become a private investigator.
In 2005, Sheila managed to get her private investigator's license, hoping it would gain her access to the evidence. By 2006, Her persistence paid off, and the Dallas police had tasked Detective Linda Crum with reopening the cold case.
When I talked to Linda, who was the police officer, she said they had the file. And I said, okay, so let's do the DNA testing. Well, evidently, it's a big deal to get DNA testing. It's very expensive, number one. And number two, I couldn't take it and just get it tested. I found that out.
A backlog in the system meant the results took almost 2 years to come through. And when they did, they didn't match any of the original suspects.
And that whole day was a bad day. Finding out was so devastating because everything I knew my entire life, everything I was told, the person, the circumstances was completely wrong, everything. So that takes you to what is actually real.
But they did find a match with an offender who was already in the system. A convicted rapist named Donald Bess, who had been serving a life sentence in Huntsville prison since 1985. In 2010, Bess was convicted of Angie's murder and sentenced to death. It was the only cold case solved in Dallas that year.
When Donald Bess was convicted, there was absolutely no closure. She's still dead. I mean, the people that talk about closure, they've really never been through something like that. So the fact that people are like, don't you feel better? Don't you feel some accomplishment? No, she's still dead.
Sheila hadn't planned on continuing as a PI once Angie's killer was found, but so many people wrote to her for help with their own cases that she decided to set up her own agency in 2011.
I met Sheila about 2 years ago. We hit it off right away. She has the ability to stick with something and go into great detail. This situation with this killer, without her staying on top of it, it would have just been another cold case never solved.
In 2016, Bess unsuccessfully appealed against the death penalty. He remains on death row.
I hope she's resting in peace now, because her life, the last few minutes were so fun.